going to now turn our attention back to the progression of the Cold War. The Suez Crisis ended in 1956, so we're basically looking at about a 4-year window here, looking at some of the issues leading up into the next decade of the 60s, which saw the entrance of President John Kennedy into the American presidency. And so pretty much you can see on the screen here the main themes of these years, which we're looking at in class with the annotating of your notes handout. And basically what's listed here revolves around Germany. There's once again an ultimatum put on Berlin, this time by Khrushchev. The first one we looked at was by Stalin in 1948. There was an unprecedented visit by Premier Khrushchev to the United States. There was discussion on the banning of nuclear testing in the atmosphere. The U-2 affair, which we've mentioned before, when our spy plane was shot down and was a huge embarrassment to President Eisenhower and damaging to the Soviet Union at the same time. There was a summit held in Paris where progress on certain issues was attempted. However, tensions rose and showed still the continuation of hostilities between us and the Soviets. African countries became a part of the Cold War equation as both our country and the Soviet Union especially tried to secure these nations in Africa for their own advantage. And finally, we'll end with the U.S. presidential election in 1960. Let's turn our attention back to Germany, which has been a central problem since the ending of World War II and the conferences at Yalta and Potsdam, which saw differences arise between the Soviets and the Americans over the issue of Germany. Things like the temporary division into 4 zones, which later solidified into 2 permanent countries, East and West Germany. The issue of reparations was always a thorn that had to be worked out. And so therefore the 2 superpowers never really could come to a firm agreement. So in 1948 there was the Berlin blockade issue, which saw our country gaining a propaganda advantage over the Soviets by our refusal to abandon the citizens of West Berlin. From that point on, things quieted down a bit when it came to Germany because things were kept at status quo with a divided country. In 1955 is when the West Germans were admitted into NATO, which then the Soviets retaliated by the formation of their own military alliance called the Warsaw Pact. From then, there was relative peace within Germany until a proposal was brought up in 1957 called the Rapaki Plan, which was proposed by the Polish Foreign Minister Adam Rapaki, and it proposed the establishment of a denuclearized zone in Central Europe, which would consist of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and both parts of Germany. This plan sounded good on paper, however, both the superpowers were not thrilled with it because the acceptance of it would mean the expense of our aims and efforts with Germany for the other country, and so therefore the proposal never really went anywhere as far as being passed, but it did show the views of both the Soviets and the Americans towards the possibility of a reunified Germany, which both of our countries weren't ready to see yet because we realized that it would have to be a neutral country and therefore it could be at the mercy of either side, the Soviets or the Americans. More likely the Soviets, seeing that they had a very strong presence in Eastern Europe. So with Germany continuing to remain divided, Khrushchev then made another move for Berlin, which had been attempted by Stalin back in 1948 when he blockaded the western sectors of Berlin from the western parts of Germany. And he was trying to do so in order to force Truman to remove our position from West Berlin. Khrushchev tried this again. In November 10th of 1958, he declared his intent to sign a peace treaty with East Germany, which would force the Western powers to negotiate access rights to West Berlin directly with the East German government. Of course, our country would not be thrilled with this idea, and we responded, our country and the British and French, saying that our rights in West Berlin had been guaranteed by the 1945 Yalta Agreements, which was before the creation of East Germany. So on November 27th, Khrushchev promised no alteration in Berlin's status for a period of 6 months, during which negotiations should lead to the withdrawal of all foreign troops and UN recognition of Berlin as a free city. The reaction to that particular proposal went over so-so. Eisenhower was willing to consider it, but he wanted to make sure that both East and West Berlin were included in this UN recognition of Berlin being a free city, and that all access routes were patrolled by UN forces. Khrushchev wanted to turn East Berlin over to East Germany, so therefore he couldn't go along with what Eisenhower wanted. Khrushchev's bottom line basically was now 6 months from this point in November for all Western forces to withdraw their force from Berlin, or else, which was kind of left open-ended and, you know, implying possibly that the Soviets might use force to make us get out of Berlin. So let's see Khrushchev's motives for doing that. Basically, he was hoping to use this threat as a negotiating tool to try to prevent West Germany from deploying any type of nuclear weapons. After the Korean War ended, that's one thing that our country began to try to do, was to rearm West Germany, which would never have been even considered after World War II. But with the outcome of Korea, where communism still existed in the north, we saw this as necessary to prevent any type of Soviet advance on Germany. If West Germany was to withdraw from NATO and East Germany was to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact, Germany would be pretty much neutralized, even if it wasn't reunified. Khrushchev had bluffed a little too much, though, and had threatened to use force back in the Suez Crisis when he said he would come in and back up the Egyptians against the Israelis. And he had made several other bluffs, and Eisenhower knew the limitations of how much nuclear force the Soviets really had because of our U-2 espionage data, which one of those planes had been shot down, but the ones that had succeeded showed that we were definitely ahead of the game when it came to nuclear weapons. One thing that Eisenhower didn't really get with this whole 6-month window was the fact that Khrushchev and the Chinese were beginning to have worsening relations. And remember, we said that we just assumed here in the United States that all communist activity was directed from Moscow and that the Chinese and the Soviets were tight with each other, which definitely wasn't the case. So Eisenhower didn't really understand the timing of this, but Khrushchev was hoping that he could get any type of Chinese support for this proposal before their relationship completely fell apart. This crisis was pretty much resolved by Eisenhower's handling of the situation. He showed a lot of skill. As this 6-month deadline approached in May of 1959, Eisenhower pretty much denied that there was a real crisis that existed because he was secure in his knowledge of where the Soviets were at with their nuclear capability. He did express his willingness to try to negotiate. He refused to panic, and he did have some contingency plans. He was prepared to do a new airlift if necessary and sever relationships altogether with Moscow, but he didn't think that this would be necessary because he was pushing for some summit meetings at London and Paris to try to settle the issue. We were hoping that we could be guaranteed results and to offer countering of arguments with other foreign ministers. This meeting was to take place in May 11th, which it did, and Khrushchev hinted that the Berlin deadline would not expire as long as the meeting was proceeding satisfactorily, and then he invited Eisenhower to visit the Soviet Union, which meant that this crisis revolving around Berlin was beginning to lift, and it was seen that Khrushchev wasn't really going to go through with this 6-month deadline. So Eisenhower was again able to secure a victory for the United States and the Western forces when it came to our part of Berlin. Briefly, I want you to see how both the superpowers extended invitations to each other for formal state visits. Like we just said, Eisenhower was invited to visit the Soviet Union after his handling of the Berlin situation, and then Eisenhower followed suit with inviting Khrushchev to come to America. Khrushchev readily accepted this invitation, and actually he announced that he would be staying for a length of time in the neighborhood of 10 days, which Eisenhower wasn't expecting. And Khrushchev said he wanted to basically tour around the country, which then Eisenhower had to accommodate. First of all, though, Nixon, the vice president of Eisenhower, visited Russia, and in a very skilled debate called the Kitchen Debate, because it took place in a model U.S. kitchen, which was at an art exhibit in the Soviet Union, Nixon was effectively able to show the strengths of the capitalist system despite Khrushchev's pointed comments that he was trying to make to prove otherwise. Khrushchev then came to America, and which was a historic visit. The visit itself went over pretty well. Some of the issues discussed included the U.S. relationship with China and the beginnings of the Chinese nuclear program and whether or not the Soviets would help in trying to delay that, pledges from the West to deny weapons to West Germany and Japan. And so definitely some of these issues, and obviously the German question, were then discussed as well. So there was some modest discussion, but basically this meeting helped to pave the way for later such trips, and it kind of helped to stabilize our relationship for the time being. There was also growing concern about the issue of nuclear test and whether or not these should continue to progress in the atmosphere and some of the damages that it could cause. This didn't see a real success until President Kennedy, so I'm just putting it up here on the screen that it was beginning to be discussed at these summits that were supposed to take place in Paris and Vienna. Also, the U-2 affair occurred at the very beginning of 1960, which was a huge blow to this supposed thaw between the Soviets and the Americans that was beginning to take place. Eisenhower blatantly admitted that he had used these U-2 spy planes when before he had denied it, and so definitely it did not do well for the relationship between Khrushchev and Eisenhower and contribute to a re-icing of the Cold War, so to speak. Obviously, with the unfolding of the U-2 affair meant that this next summit meeting in Paris, where they were supposed to make a lot of progress on different issues, was basically derailed. Khrushchev was very angry and beside himself about Eisenhower's decision not only to admit to the U-2 flights, but to resume them. And so therefore, there was no real progress made at this Paris summit, and the superpowers continued to go back into a state of hostility. Many African nations at the same time in the late 50s were beginning to become independent as the previous colonial powers such as Britain and France were losing control over many places that they had had around the world, Africa being a big part of that. As many of these nations moved towards independence, there was concern between both the Americans and the Soviets as to who they would begin to support. And both our country and the Soviets were trying to decide what our policy should be towards Africa. Of course, we would want these countries to be friendly to our side. Both us and the Soviets desired that. And so therefore we had to try to figure out how to intervene in these countries in not an aggressive way, but to show that we wanted to gain them for our own interests going further into the Cold War. So up comes the election of 1960. Eisenhower's already had 2 terms in office, so therefore he's not running again. His vice president, Richard Nixon, would be the candidate for the Republican ticket. And then John F. Kennedy, who had had a very well-established name with his family, was running for the Democratic ticket. At this point, the relationship between Khrushchev and Eisenhower was extremely tense. In fact, shortly before the election took place, the year before actually, in September of 1959, Khrushchev had addressed the UN in a very outraged fashion. He actually took his shoe off and pounded it on the desk, saying that the Soviets would bury the Americans at some point in the future. So that's pretty much what Kennedy was facing when he came into office as the president. It was a close race. There was several televised debates in which the TV added to Kennedy's prestige and popularity, and he is now able to pursue a new relationship with Khrushchev. He's from the other political party, but the 2 biggest problems that await Kennedy are situations that were unfolding with Cuba, as Fidel Castro just became the new leader, and then also the German question, which was still hanging in the air. So lastly, let's look at some of the first issues and policies that JFK put out there. He was known for an approach called flexible response, which was a differing approach than what Eisenhower and Truman had taken with the Cold War. Instead of massive retaliation, brinkmanship, and some of these very hardline approaches involving a lot of nuclear force, Kennedy felt it was best to have a variety of options, not just nuclear ones. So he suggested both a buildup of conventional troops and weapons along with nuclear weapons, and to create programs and groups such as the Special Forces, so that we had a variety of options to pick from when it came to working with the Soviet Union and when tensions arose. Kennedy also made several steps towards securing a better relationship with countries in the Western Hemisphere. He created the Alliance for Progress, which was to have cooperative aid projects sent to Latin American countries, similar to the Marshall Plan and how they tried to support European countries so as to not fall to communism. Kennedy also created the Peace Corps, where we could show our humanitarian side as a nation by helping underdeveloped countries around the world, and it would send America's youth to do this work, which would give us a very positive image. Also, Kennedy challenged Americans to land a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, and he issued that challenge in his first inaugural address, and we know by 1969 that was accomplished, and this was in direct response to the Soviets launching Sputnik back in 1957. Kennedy's biggest challenge, which we'll go into a lot more detail, was at the Bay of Pigs, where he failed miserably in this attempted takeover of the Cuban government and the removal of Castro from power. Kennedy also had to deal with the Berlin Wall and the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we'll discuss more in detail in class. But these were the main things that Kennedy had to face when it came to the Cold War as president.